Now, before I get into this video, let me say up front, a lot of Europeans are going to be offended. If you are the sensitive type, this is not the video for you. Now, there are a lot of things that blacks are expected to accept. The new scientific racism is that, on average, black people have a lower IQ than whites and Asians. Now, this is supposed to be scientific, so they expect black people to not be sensitive about it and to just accept it as science and try to step their intellectual game up. Okay, fine. If we're going to accept that, among other things, I expect Europeans to be mature and accept the fact that the first time that the masses of Europeans ever knew how to read and write was in the 1700s and 1800s. After the Renaissance era, the Enlightenment era, again, the first time that the masses, right, more than 1% of the entire European population, the first time that more than 1% learned how to read and write was a couple hundred years after the Renaissance era. At no other point in history, especially not in the BC era, did the masses of Europeans know how to read and write. And ancient Greece never existed. Ancient Rome never existed. Now, a few excerpts of a pretty good website who gives a summary of Anatoly Fomenko's book. It says recorded history before the 11th and 14th centuries is essentially unreliable. Poor timekeeping devices, inconsistent record keeping, limited availability of surviving documents, lack of movable type, so on and so forth. Fomenko argues that pre-Renaissance history was largely fabricated by a number of writers, most of whom did so at the behest of the Catholic Church and other Christian leaders of the time, so that they could present historical evidence to back up claims made in the Bible. According to Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology, history as we know it was fabricated by Christian scholars. Joseph Scaliger ranks among the leading historians of the time who helped forge and propagate the false record of pre-Renaissance history, end quote. Now, Joseph Scaliger began working on the chronology that we use today in the late 1400s, right? I believe it was around 1480. No, I'm sorry, 1580. Excuse me. Around 1580, the 1500s. And it was completed in the early 1600s. Right? It was expanded on a little bit by a Jesuit, but it was essentially completed by Joseph Scaliger. Now, before you get offended and think it's ridiculous that history of the BC era in regard to the Greeks and Romans is a fairy tale, let's talk about one other fairy tale that you have to know is a fairy tale. And if you believe it's real history, I feel sorry for you, because it tells me that your brain does not function properly. That is the Children's Crusade. If you believe this is real history, I feel sorry for you. Now, I took a class on the Crusades many years ago in college. They say a bunch of kids plotted among themselves to go to war with grown Muslim men. I mean kids, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, 11, 12 years old, 14, 15, 16. Folks, children don't think like that. Show me one other era, war, where the children plotted among themselves to go fight grown men. In regard to kids, they are the same regardless of era. When kids see a grown man chop off the head of another grown man, they run in fear. They never, ever, ever think to themselves that they want to be involved in a war as well. This never happened. A fairy tale created to hide what really happened. And that is the grown-ups told the kids, you're coming with us. Don't worry, God will protect you. And the plan from the very beginning was to sell the kids to the Muslims. And they tried to cover it up with this ridiculous story. What type of parents would allow their children to go off and fight grown Muslim men in war anyways? Do you really believe the average person was that stupid simply because they were filled with the Holy Ghost? Simply because it was a long time ago and you think the psychology of humans was different back then? Again, if you believe that, I feel sorry for you on an intellectual level, right? Your pistons are not firing properly. Your elevator does not go to the top. So with that ridiculous, absurd story in mind, let's dive into the history of ancient Greece. Now, this is according to mainstream academia. There's a group of people in Europe before the present day Europeans, before the Italians, before the Greeks. These people are called the Minoans. These are educated people, literate people. They can read and write. They are attacked by the first Greeks, called the Mycenaeans. Something destabilizes the Minoan civilization, and the Mycenaeans see that that's a good time to go and overthrow them. Now, the Mycenaeans were illiterate, uncivilized savages. Why do I say that? Because they were illiterate. They did not learn how to read or write until after they overthrew the Minoans and took their alphabet. They say that they also added vowels to their alphabet and taught themselves how to read and write. Now let's stop right there. I don't believe that. Folks, I'm sorry. Now, my name on this channel is deliberate. I see myself as a student. I'm not going to project myself as a teacher of history. I don't believe there are any teachers. Our information is far too flawed and unreliable. All of us are students for the entire duration of our lives. I don't believe this. When you're talking about a group of illiterate people, the only way for them to become literate is to attend institutions of learning for several years. They don't simply pick up an alphabet from a literate people and add vowels. How ridiculous is that? If they knew what vowels were and were smart enough to add them to a phonetic alphabet from a people who speak a different language, they would have created their own alphabet before they got there. Right? That is ridiculous. That is not a proven method for an illiterate people to become literate. They do not simply pick up the alphabet from a literate people and simply teach themselves how to read and write. That sounds as ridiculous as the Children's Crusade. But let's go on with this fairy tale history. So the Mycenaeans overthrow the Minoans and they rule for about 300 years. And then they themselves are attacked by a people of mysterious origin called the Sea People. Now, the Sea People are said to have devastated the entire ancient Mediterranean world, right, and caused the collapse of the Bronze Age, right? These are a group of very warlike, uncivilized people, the Sea People. I personally believe that there was no attack from the Sea People, and if there was, then the Sea People were attacking another illiterate group of primitive savages, right? Both the Mycenaeans and the Sea People were illiterate, uncivilized savages. They even say that many of the Mycenaeans joined forces with the Sea People. So this is said to have sparked the Dark Ages. You gotta understand, Europeans are said to have undergone two different Dark Ages, the Greek Dark Age and the Medieval Dark Age. So this attack from the Sea People is said to have been so devastating that it sent the Greeks into the Dark Ages. They forgot how to read and write. Okay, let's stop there. I don't believe that. If a people truly becomes literate, and they're literate for about 300 years, they don't need learning institutions to pass the knowledge of literacy down to their offspring. Just like your offspring will learn how to tie their shoes, will learn how to speak the language, you can teach them how to read the language as well and write the language as well. You don't need learning institutions for everything. Some things are taught by our first teachers. Our first teachers are our parents. I don't believe it. Okay? So, according to their history, they forgot how to read and write and decided they wanted to become a literate people again. How did they do it? Yet again, they are said to have borrowed an alphabet from a different group, another group who speak a different language. This is another problem with borrowing alphabets. You're talking about borrowing alphabets from people who speak a different language. First it was the Minoans. Now they borrow an alphabet from a people called the Phoenicians, another group who never existed. They made up this entire ancient Greek history. Again, you don't simply borrow alphabet. That is not a proven path for illiterate people to become literate. And allegedly, according to their story, as soon as they borrow this new alphabet, that's the era of Homer. So what's the first thing they want to do when they learn how to read and write again? They want to run around reading poems and stories. Also, when they learn to read and write again, that is said to have sparked the Archaic period. So all of a sudden, almost overnight, they start building these immaculate temples, structures, and monuments, these sculptures, just out of nowhere. I'm not buying it. I'm sorry. I am not buying this foolishness. You're talking about a level of building that would have required at least hundreds of years of evolution. Not immediately coming out of a dark age, but allegedly. They learn to read and write, and immediately here's Homer. And here, out of nowhere, all these immaculate buildings. Now, this is the Archaic period. The art during this period has poses, right, and postures that are identical to the Egyptians. Now, how is that possible? How is that possible? This is long before they allege that the Greeks entered Egypt. They're said to have entered Egypt under Alexander in the Hellenistic period, around 323 BCE. So what are you saying? That they just went to Egypt every now and then, peeking around a corner, looking at their statues and say, oh, let's build our statues like that. Absolute Rubbish. So in the classical period, they get more creative and more distinct. They catch humans in motion, right? And they get even more creative in their sculptures during the Hellenistic period. This is all rubbish. Rubbish. Let's take a look at what I believe to be the real timeline. As soon as the Mycenaeans attack and overthrow the original settlers, who they call the Minoans, that sparks the Dark Ages. They overthrew a literate, educated, advanced people. I don't buy this nonsense that they picked up their alphabet, knew what vowels were, added vowels, and taught themselves how to read and write. Who do you think you're talking to? I have not been into history for the past 22 years for someone to lay foolishness like this on my plate. So they sparked the Dark Ages. Europe had a light age prior to the arrival of the first Greeks. The settlers of Greece were literate, the Minoans or whoever they were. And when the Mycenaeans overthrew them, the Dark Ages of Europe started at that point, and they did not come out of it until the 1700s, 1800s. This is the world's best kept secret. Understand, if there are no ancient Greeks, then there are no ancient Romans. This also eliminates the ancient Roman Empire. Look at the Romanesque architecture of the 1100s, 1200s, the medieval period. Why were they still building in the same way that they built during the alleged ancient Roman Empire? Why? Because the 1100s and 1200s is the real date of the Roman Empire, not the BC era, not the first century BCE. It was the medieval times. The medieval era is the era of both the Greeks and the Romans. And like Professor Walter Williams said, there was never any Plato, never existed. These are fictional characters. No Aristotle, no Socrates. These are fictional characters. No Herodotus, no Josephus. Also note, whenever they want to prove the existence of the ancient Greeks, they refer to a fictional historian that they themselves created. It's not rocket science. When they want to create a history like this, they create historians and they write through the historians. No primary sources of no Plato, no Socrates, none of these philosophers ever existed. Alexander never existed. And they remained in the Dark Ages. They're too primitive to understand the value of literacy, the value of education. All they know is war, attack, take, war, attack, take. Read the book, Iceman Inheritance, written by a European, where he talks about how the environment shaped the mentality of Europeans, a mentality of taking from others, attacking others, living a primitive, savage lifestyle. So they sparked their own dark age. They were in the dark age before they got to Europe. They simply brought Europe into the Dark Ages, and they did not come out until after they were educated by the Moors during what we call the medieval period. A couple hundred years after the Renaissance era. The first schools in Europe were built in the 1500s in Germany. Well, the first schools that were built by Europeans were in Germany in the 1500s. And then they spread throughout Europe and eventually the Western Hemisphere later. But the masses of Europeans did not know how to read and write until the late 1700s and 1800s. Prior to that time, Europeans were illiterate, and they had been illiterate for the entire duration of their existence. Look at the sculptures that are said to be from ancient Greece. Compare them to the sculptures that are said to be from the Italian Renaissance era. They're identical. You can't tell them apart. Why? Because they were all built during the Italian Renaissance era. Look at the Colosseum. Look at these other temples that are said to be from ancient Greece. Look at how they have aged. They look the same age as the medieval castles, right? The structures that they admit were built during the Middle Ages. They look the same age. The Colosseum does not look any older than these medieval castles. Why? Because they were all built during the Middle Ages. That is why during the Italian Renaissance era, all of these so-called Greek artifacts started to pop up out of nowhere. Why? Because they were actually creating them. That is why virtually all famous Italian artists existed during the Italian Renaissance era. Michelangelo, so on and so forth. It is because all of it, all of the so-called ancient Greek temples and sculptures, all of it was created during the medieval times, the Italian Renaissance era. They were ashamed that they had been illiterate for so long, ashamed to have been so far behind. Africans did not want to share with the world that they were civilized by the Moors. The Moors taught them how to read and write, taught them about civilization in general. The Moors were building universities all throughout Spain. The Moors taught them to take baths, that the world was a sphere. Right? This is just in the 1400s. They thought you could fall off the edge of the earth. You're talking about an extremely primitive people who essentially showed up on this planet yesterday. They wanted to create a great history for themselves, on par with the Egyptians. They were extremely envious of the Egyptians. They wanted to create a great history for themselves. So they projected a civilization alongside and on par with the ancient Egyptians. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news. You have no great ancient history. They wanted to hide the fact that Europeans do not have a presence in the ancient world. So this is what we have today. Fairy tales as history. The only great people of antiquity, of the BC era, were the Egyptians. And you are projecting a false history to people to give them a sense of pride. to make them believe that they are superior to other people of the world. It is a dangerous but sad and pathetic act of race superiority. It's really sad when you're so pathetic that you have to make your history up. So we're going to get deeper into this. This is going to have to be a video series. Already I can hear the objections to several points. We're going to deal with all of them in future videos.